So that's the 6 questions?
Just the, oh, okay.
No.
Six
There's-
questions.
There's another one he handed out. It's double-sided.
It's double-sided. He didn't say he wasn't. All right, the time being 7 o'clock, I'd like to call this meeting of the Chelmsford Tax Classification Study Committee to order. Please join me in the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag
The United States of America, and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you and welcome. This meeting's being recorded and televised by Chelmsford Telemedia. If there's anyone present who's planning to record, please indicate at this time. Okay. There are no minutes, so we will move right into new business. The first item under new business is a discussion of the report format, its objectives, and topics. We, I think, finally have a mission statement that works, and part of the discussion around that was that we needed to keep objectives separate. That might be as good a place as any to start tonight. I'm just going to go around, I guess, and see what sorts of things do people think ought to be in the report that we issue. What would you like to see in the final report? Dan?
What we collected, or what we're able to collect from the town business community, what we're able to collect from, and in some of the towns that have gone into classification and come out of it. I mean, I could go on and on and on.
Well, let's talk a little bit about what you'd like to, what kind of information you think we might collect
Well,
from.
one of the things I did this past week is I polled 4 or 5 town residents that, if they're not retired, they should be. Did I say that? And my question to them was, because I was looking for, would people respond to a number or would they respond to a percentage of, as a resident, how much would they like to save if this was implemented? And it was unanimous that the number was $200. And I don't know whether that was because they were all together. But I know they all had similar values of property
Okay.
in the area of whatever the town average is. And they were pretty
Yeah,
close to the average.
380 to 400.
I mean, there
something
was a
like that.
lawyer and there was a couple of retired town employees and there was a retired X-ray technician, and I thought it was interesting that they came up with 200.
Maybe that's a good jumping off point into the whole question of surveys.
And so my question was, do you go ask the question about percent or a number?
Or do we ask it at all? And this goes back to something we talked about the very first night, kind of opinions versus facts. And I think it is a fact that, 5 out of 5 said $200. But if you want to do a survey, I think the question of whether it's just an assortment of opinions or fact kind of hinges on, do we get enough responses? And how do we track those responses? How do we make sure they're unique responses? And I think this is something that applies to the business side as well as to the residential side. If you go back and look at the survey that was reported in the 1995 report, they report 25 business responses. That's out of something like 1,000 businesses in town, and 280 or 290 properties classified as CIP. That's not a statistically significant sampling. And I would have serious reservations about reporting something like that out. When you get too small a sample, you're far more likely to have, bias, and even just kind of an inhomogeneous sampling of the population as a whole. But what you say, I think, is interesting information that may or may not be of interest to the Board of Selectmen as they try to make a decision like this. I'm not really quite sure how to handle it, but I will say that I think if we go the survey route, we're going to have to work hard to make sure that the results are meaningful instead of just a bunch of responses. So I'm afraid it's going to be a little bit more complicated than just putting up a Survey Monkey thing and letting people answer it 5 times.
Well, I went as far as thinking about where do you go? Because we tried this survey with the Charter Review Committee.
Mhm.
And out of 35,000 residents, or whatever the number is,
Right.
we got that many. Nobody responded. Nobody came forward. Nobody came to the meetings.
I honestly don't think the Board of Selectmen have had a much larger response when you hold your open hearings on this, right? I mean,
Depends.
you've had,
Periodically we do, yeah.
but we're talking about a handful of people.
Yeah.
Certainly not a significant cross-section of the town.
But I think you don't get a cross-section of the town, speaking for living here 20 years and not understanding that any of this was ever going on, is that it's not publicized enough or talked about enough on a regular basis. Because when I did the same survey you did and gave them the numbers that you came up with and said, well, it could be, it could only be like $365, and they said a year, and this was my development. So you've got a whole different realm of people that are thinking, I never thought of percentage. But another thing, when you're saying that, I want to know when those people, no offense to anybody on the selectmen that are sitting here listening to me, but I can remember when I was here in December, and a businessman got up and said to you guys, to the selectmen, you all made a promise to us that you would not change the tax rate. So, are you going back on, I'm sitting back going, are you kidding me? Times change. I mean, something that was said 3 years ago, I was just astounded that they would even do that anybody would stand there and say that to them. So I got up and said, hey, we all elected you, you have to, that didn't work either. But, so my question to that is, I don't think it's ever been publicized enough, or, we've got to do something to get it out if that's the way you want to go.
Well, I'm sorry, what needs to be publicized? That we're asking for information?
That we're asking for
or that there's an
information.
annual hearing on tax classification rates in Chelmsford?
I think that there's a hearing on actual tax classifications in Chelmsford.
All right, well, I hope our report is going to, make it a little bit higher profile this time around. And certainly, if one of the sections of the report is recommendations for future action, one of those things might be to do more work around publicizing the public hearing portion of the tax classification question.
The next question I have is, this report going to suggest to the Board of Selectmen they do something? where the Board of Assessors doesn't suggest, they give them the raw data,
Right.
and it's up to them being the board, to make a decision. Whether or not they've said before, we're not gonna do that, I could
Right.
certainly handle that in a public hearing.
Well, and that might be the
But-
that might be the right place to do it. I will say that for myself, I did not come into this committee expecting to make a final judgment one way or the other. My view of the role of this committee is to look at a somewhat narrow set of information and data, but not to take quite the expansive view that the selectmen need to. That said, I'm willing to go wherever the committee wants to go on this. If there's a strong feeling that we should be recommending or advocating for something, I'm willing to. I'm not going to oppose that, and I think I'd like to see that kind of evolve as we go through the process of putting the report together. But I think the question of, is it good for residential homeowners is going to be answered oppositely of the question of is it good for residential business owners, right? I don't think you can't have both sides win, and I think that kind of a judgment call is exactly what the selectmen are elected to do. That's not I don't see that necessarily as being the role of this committee. I think we'd better serve them by saying, if you do this, these are the benefits that homeowners can expect. If you keep a 1.0 rate, these are the benefits that business owners might expect.
See, I came to this with the idea we were going to suggest to the Board of Selectmen, you should do X, Y, Z, or nothing. And I have not prejudged what we should do. The last time I did that, I changed my mind. Because I prejudged the grinder pump situation. And I changed my mind in the middle of all that. I kind of think the charter committee information we tried to gather didn't affect people as personally as dollars in or out of their pocket. And that's a big difference. Very big difference. So maybe that's a bad analogy. The other thing I was going to suggest was maybe we confine the requests for information from residents to the town meeting reps. Because there's a cross-section of the town.
Oh, I see. You're saying send the survey
Send
only
it-
to town meeting reps.
Well, at least focus on them, because one, you can do it rather easily. 90% of their emails are in the system. It's a cross-section of the community, except there's a significant number of municipal employees by the broad definition. And I don't know how many business owners are there, because I've never looked at the complete demographics of it. But it was an area we could focus on.
I suppose that you could include that as a question if you want to survey them, is do you own a local business?
Yeah.
I think even then, we'd probably have to report it out with the caveat that it may not be reflective of the entire town. But yeah, I don't know, that might be of interest to the selectmen. And it might be an interesting proxy, you know, if the town meeting reps don't know this stuff, then I think it's a pretty sure bet that the town at large does not.
Oh, I don't think the town at large knows or understands any of this.
The overwhelming majority of the town meeting reps don't see the numbers until the night of the town meeting. They look at the book, or books,
Yeah,
and they make a vote, push the button. There's a handful that ask questions over and over and over and over. But that's it. They don't go to the planning board meetings, they don't go to the finance committee meetings, they don't go to the board of selectmen meetings, they certainly don't go to the economic development meetings. There's so many people that are apathetic, is that a good word?
Well, I do think that there are apathetic people, but you find that every place.
Oh,
I think
it's not unique.
No, I think
No.
it's a great idea to give them, the town reps, I think they'd appreciate it, an opportunity to answer questions. You know, possibly they have questions from their constituents that they can pass along. I think that's wonderful. I think that could be one way. I think another way would be to just have a public input session here, because you're gonna get that many people. You
Well,
don't need
or
another.
at the police station, or even a larger venue. I mean, we
Yeah.
we can set it up for the senior center.
I don't feel you'll get that many people.
No, we might not. But I hate to, I'd rather be in a half-full room than one that's packed, standing room only.
Oh, not me.
Well, I think for a one-off like this, I
Yeah.
don't want anybody to feel like they didn't have an opportunity, or they got there and it was
Well,
too hot, or they couldn't find a seat.
Well, but I just think that if there's a half-filled room, it looks like nobody's interested.
That might be a point of information as well.
True, so whatever, but we would give the town reps an opportunity to speak their mind, their voice, and also the community. And within the community, the business community, so that would be the entire community. I also think that for an objective, that we need to look at the macro sense so far as whatever recommendations, and I don't think we need to have one recommendation to the selectmen. I think we can have more than one, like you had, indicated before, Mike. But I do think we need to take into consideration strongly whatever recommendations we have, how we can see it helping the entire town, the residents, because of maybe other indications, maybe it would help them in the future. But I think we need to look at it as a whole community, as something that we need to look positively toward the future for the entire town. And, maybe there's compromises in there that are not obvious right now. But I think it's very important in any objective that we get out there to the Board of Selectmen or to the community, that we are looking at the residents' best interest now and in the future, and also the businesses. Because, it's the town of Chelmsford. And how is it gonna look in the future versus how it looks now?
Okay.
Just my input.
Thoughts?
Yeah, my thoughts are more like, and again, the problem of getting this out, distributing this and getting people to read it and whatever is important. But I think of this more as the final report as an educational tool, and maybe an educational tool for the selectmen as much. Now, I guess, and I will admit, I don't always watch the hearings and know precisely what Frank presents and how it's presented. But I certainly do not necessarily, until some years ago when Frank made a presentation that I was present at, understand what the implications are. And I'd like to, be able to show in a document, if you do this, this is what happens. This is, and for the various kinds of things, we've talked about small business exemptions, residential exemptions, split tax rate. Show who is who is helped, who is hurt, or
Right. Who pays more? Who pays
and
less?
how much more? Give
Right.
some examples. I would like to, and I started this afternoon, and then it was too late and didn't get it done. Like to, for example, and look at back data. If we had implemented 10% shift 3 years ago, how does that play down? If you continued that, how does that play down in future years? Because somebody's made the comment, okay, maybe this year people get a tax break, next year their taxes are gonna go up anyway, and they're gonna complain again because their taxes went up. How much is it implicated? And I guess I'd like to have a report that has some of these numbers in, that shows concretely, this is what happens. We reduce the taxpayers' taxes by, I'm just throwing out numbers
Right.
that are not connected to anything. 10%, that business's numbers are gonna go up 50%. And put it in those terms. And I don't know whether, Pat, has data in that form ever come to you before a tax hearing?
Absolutely, yeah.
Has it?
That's what-
Backward-looking projection?
Backwards?
No, not
Forward-looking?
Not backward-looking, but, you know, what the, at the current time, what the different consequences would be, what the different
Okay.
impacts would be. But as, you know, kind of what you're getting to, Paul Cohen last time when he was here, he mentioned about a couple of years ago when we had like $3 million in free cash,
Right.
and we put $1 million of that into
Right.
tax relief. But then the following year, because of consequences, we had to use that excess
Right.
levy, and obviously, you know, as you mentioned, taxes went up significantly, and people said, what happened here? So it would,
Right.
you know, it's
Which
almost
is
that
why,
way.
as a FinCom member, I did not support using that money for tax relief, because I knew that that had every likelihood of happening the following year. It's why, if you implement tax relief one year, you don't make it go away, or certainly not the next year.
But I don't know how you could do backward-looking, because I don't know how you can anticipate what would have happened. You know, if you did 10% 3 years ago, but then how do you know we wouldn't have gone, you know, down from there or up
Well,
from there?
that's, I'm
So
just saying.
There's
Well,
just too many different,
What I'd like to say is, if you implemented, say, 10% 3 years ago, how did that affect, and continued that, how did that affect the next year? How did it affect the year?
I think we could actually look at that, and it might,
But I don't-
it
I-
might be
I-
of some interest. We know we're taxing to the levy limit every year.
right.
And in fact, you don't even have to argue about it, because you can go to prior years, just work it out for the last, 3 known years, where everybody went through the exercise of setting a budget, so that there's no speculation about it. Again, this is only a shift between the residential and the CIP properties,
But
right?
again-
So you can, even if you get a 10% reduction that first year, the growth to levy the following year is probably going to wipe it out. I'm curious to see, because, as you say, nobody's done that work.
I understand, but I still don't see how you can speculate what would have happened 3 years ago, and then 2 years ago, and then 1 year ago.
Well, I think that's what she's saying, is just say it's a 1.1
Then why not go back
split.
5 years or 7
Well,
years? Or,
Fine.
Yeah, I mean,
It just-
at that point, it's just a spreadsheet calculation, I
Yes.
think.
It's just a speculation, yeah.
Right, but it might shed some light on whether this is really a good mechanism for
For long-term.
residential tax
residential
relief or
relief.
not.
I guess my point is, I think there has to be a greater understanding, certainly among the community, that says, why don't you implement a split tax rate? As to what that means, how much it means, and the various people it impacts. And that's, from my perspective, in a report, what I
What
would like,
we're- yeah,
part of
what-
what I want to see in there.
Thoughts on what you'd like to see out of this report?
Well, I guess what I would like to see is have it be more factual rather than opinion-based, obviously. And I would not be looking, I've mentioned this to you, not recommendations, because that's what the Board of Selectmen is there for. That's part of their job. It's mandated by law. They have to hold this public hearing, and really shouldn't give an indication before the public hearing on how they would vote as far as certain exemptions or the split tax rate or not. So, and I think part of the mission for this committee is to study in more detail some of those exemptions and how those maybe could be used to provide more relief, and how that would impact the town, some of which we heard last week are reimbursed by the state, some are not. Some, the town, picks up all of that, so it's kind of a wash, or, zero-sum game. If we benefit somebody, then somebody else is gonna, be hurt. And I think as far as the impacts and the consequences are important, if they can be spelled out in an objective manner.
Okay. Yeah, I think Dan talked a little bit about that last time around, just kind of, if you just pick a rate, whatever it happens to be, and use it as an illustrative one, to see what kind of savings does a homeowner receive, what sorts of additional taxes are paid by the local businesses. Again, you have to make assumptions about, average value houses and
Which was my point of example, but I just go back because we have data going back.
Exactly.
And we can
you can do
say-
the same
we
thing.
can
Yeah,
do
make
the same
some of the
thing.
same starting assumptions and see how it plays out.
And from the
I think
future,
that's an
we can
interesting
say if we
idea.
do it this year, well, what does that mean for, well, we don't know.
Right, do you
but
have to keep giving bigger and bigger cuts every year? If you
and
just do it
I
once, does
think-
it help at all?
I think looking at a small interval of time, you can sort of get a feel for how does this work over time?
Mm-hmm.
And that's all I would be doing it for, is an example with real numbers of how this would work over time.
I mean, I think it's important that everybody realize how complex it is. I mean, it isn't just going in and picking a number, and that's
Right.
why, it is a pretty lengthy presentation that Frank gives us
Right.
that night, and why we typically don't vote on it that same day. So we do have an opportunity to see if we need additional information, and to try to, inform the public that we are talking about this now. I mean, we go through all the steps, we advertise in the local newspapers, we talk about it at our meetings, and, I understand Helen's concern that we don't, that not everybody knows about it. Well, not everybody knows about it because you start, getting into it, and your head can be spinning, because there are so many.
It's way inside baseball, right?
It is,
Not
it is.
everyone is that
I
interested.
mean, there's 1,000 different ways that we could, we could set the rate.
Mm-hmm.
There really is,
Right.
when you consider all the exemptions and all the little
Right.
nuances. So it's, like I said, it's not something to just go in and say, okay, this is it, and that's the way it's gonna be.
So something you mentioned briefly there, additional information. That might be the sort of thing that we could get non-controversial recommendations out of the committee on. Again, you may recuse yourself or not.
I would.
But if looking at previous presentations, if there are other metrics we think ought to be included, that might be the sort of thing that whether no matter where you stand on the question of what the rate should be, you can agree that we should be looking at certain metrics to see if it's working or not. And I think that'll need more discussion. But yeah, I think there's a lot of room for recommendations at various points along the way. And I understand what you're saying, too. Helen, thoughts?
Something you just said where you didn't think that many people were interested. I haven't found one that wasn't, one way or the other. Either a business, I have people in business who aren't even speaking to me anymore because of this. And it's like ridiculous. It's true, but it's ridiculous. And then I have people that I said, oh, I'm on this. Oh, good, then you're going to do something. Nah, we're going to just figure it out. So I think we need to figure it out and give recommendations. Maybe not recommendations, but just lay it out. This is one way, this is the other way, and then let the Board of Selectmen just do their thing.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting idea. Create some scenarios and say, if you do this and this, this is what you would expect to see, right? These are the impacts. I think the only thing I'll add to that is that there's more than one. It's not just an up or down scenario.
Oh,
Right,
I agree
mean,
with
with
that,
the
right.
you can include the residential exemption. There are other things that you can do. You can include the small commercial exemption, and each of those will have some effect. So again, in terms of how does this affect various people in town, maybe we need to have not just an average homeowner and an average business, but maybe we need to break that down a little bit more. A residential exemption is going to help people whose houses are under average value, and it'll cost people whose houses are above average value more. So, and again, I think it's helpful to see how much are we talking about there. But I think it might be more complicated than just a couple of average properties.
I agree.
No, I definitely, the more people talk, the more complicated it gets.
Yeah, at some point I'd like to cap the complications so that it's,
Yeah, I
so
was
that we
thinking the
can
same
say
thing.
we've bounded the universe.
Would it help us to hear like we did last week if we had tax people that do businesses and tax people that do residences and say what the new,
I think that would be helpful. Again, I'd like to examine this all the way through. I think it's simple to say, well, if you know, depending on what the tax classification rate is, your local taxes are higher or lower. But but nobody looks at just their local taxes. What people really care about is how it hits their pocketbook. And there are, you know, on an annual basis, there are additional kind of down the road implications when you get to the state and federal taxes. Yeah, have we heard anything?
No,
back?
I'm trying to get that
Okay,
information.
and that's fine. I mean, I think that is definitely something I think we should be doing. That should be one of the evenings that we have is just hearing from somebody, even if it's a written presentation of this is where the leverage is. It may turn out to only be a 5% difference one way or another. I just don't know. I'm not a tax preparer, but I agree with you that we should hear that information.
okay.
And it would be better if we could ask questions, all things being equal.
But
Any-
we would need two different tax people, somebody who does residents and somebody who does strictly businesses.
Or somebody who knows the difference in
Yeah,
both.
both sides.
So I'm trying to get that person, if possible.
Thank you.
Yeah. Evan, thoughts on what this ought to look like?
Yeah, so I think one way, and I like the idea of the scenarios. If we can do a look back, great. Forecasting, scenarios make sense to me. I think part of looking back and forecasting, we can learn a lot of lessons and see trends from other communities. That's not Chelmsford specific, but it may guide us or assist us and make coming to some conclusions. Mike, I like your idea about doing pros and cons or cause and effect related to those scenarios. As I'm looking at these questions, I think a lot of these questions, it may be easier for us to answer these questions and then figure out how to organize the report based upon what list of questions we do answer. And I think a pretty critical component of the report is documenting current or existing conditions, both from the CIP and the residential. And I think all that information is pretty readily accessible. You know, you see the 10-year single-family tax bill, and then that plays into, you know, scenario and role-playing. You know, it may speak to the 1-to-4 ratio or what have you. But I think documenting existing conditions is pretty important. And then finally, on public comment and input, I don't have a strong preference one way or the other. I kind of view that as the selectman's role. My concern for this committee doing surveys or public input sessions is that it's very time-consuming. And I'm not sure what we're gonna use that information for. I think we may be better off presenting information and then asking for a response immediately, kind of like a town meeting where you have the clicker system. And if you were to present some of these scenarios.
That's an idea. Yeah. Or even just doing quizzes. You know, do you want? Does the
Something, yeah.
anybody who's in the audience, you can vote up or down. Do you understand this explanation?
Yes,
Is more
something like that.
transparency or
I think a
clarity
survey,
required?
asking people's opinions. I think we all know the opinion, and we're tasked with trying to figure out how do you go about that, but strike a reasonable balance.
Yeah, that's an interesting idea there, because
like
we
that.
could repurpose the clickers probably. And that might ask that could still allow us to ask questions like dollars or percentages, right? We'll be limited to the people in the room, and so again, it's all going to have to be taken with a grain of salt. But it you know, if they're interested enough to come out, then maybe their opinion is worth a little bit more.
I mean, I guess my question about a dollar or percentages, okay, so $200, that means $200, they want to pay $200 less than what they pay now? They want to pay $200 less than what a business pays? They want, what does that
Sure.
$200
Every
mean?
year, or every
Yeah.
year.
Right, does
Right.
it have to be every year it goes down $200?
That's kind of,
Exactly.
speaking of the scenarios, is
Right.
it sustainable?
Right. Yeah, or is it even noticeable,
Right.
given the fact that your taxes are going up?
I was gonna say, $200 on an average tax bill in this town is not one, not a whole lot. Which surprises me. I mean, the average tax bill in Chelmsford on the average valuation is over $7,000. And people are happy with
That's right.
200?
That's right. I wouldn't be.
Well, I think.
My number
I
would
think
be
it's-
500. To make it
Okay.
worth my while.
Yep,
200, I hate
Ready
to
to
say
say
it.
10%, but
right,
Take it. You need it.
right.
anyway.
Because my other concern is not paying the unfunded liability.
Right. Yeah, there,
That's
We-
the
we
elephant
will-
in the room that nobody wants to deal with.
Yeah, but that really has nothing to do with this, because the amount of taxes we collect is not going to change based on tax classification.
That's true.
So
That's true. Understood.
that's a totally different topic.
Okay.
okay. Do we want to try to thrash out public input right now? Like when it should happen at least?
Sure, yeah.
I think what based on what people have said up till now, September looks like the first really reasonable time to ask people to come out. Do we want to do it on a Tuesday? Do we want to try to pick a different day? My feeling is, without looking at a calendar, Tuesdays are as good as any other day. The sorts of things you might run into would be an early season open house at the schools,
School committee meetings.
school committee meeting perhaps, although those are usually lightly attended in person. Are there other concerns?
Just the election, but that's at the 18th of
Right.
September.
What election? The
Primary.
primary?
The
That's the
primary.
4th.
You're right,
Why?
it's the day after Labor Day.
It really is.
Well,
So
thank
maybe
you
the
for
18th would be
having,
a
I
good
don't know
time to
why.
have
when
it.
I
Well,
look
so
at
the-
the polls,
That's
I'll be the
awfully
only one.
close to when we want to get this report. We're
Yeah.
talking about
That's
having this.
really, I think that's
report.
really the problem, right? Is that if we need to report out, be at the meeting on the first, is it, or the second?
You were saying October 1st, yeah, would,
Right, if we're gonna recommend, if people think we might try to recommend that the selectmen deal with this a little earlier, then I think we have got to be there for that first meeting in October, before town meeting starts, and that means, yeah, we'll have 3 meetings in September. We could dedicate probably the first of them, so the 11th would be public
Colleen,
input to give us,
Go to the September calendar, which,
that would give us the most time to kind of collate that information and put it together, I guess.
You might have to do August.
I would almost suggest August. I mean, school's going to start before Labor Day this
I
year.
agree with that.
August 28th is a Tuesday before Labor Day. I don't know that you're going to have much different attendance from the end of August or middle September, quite frankly, and then you do have a little bit more
And
time
then
to.
you got it, right, and with our last
do
3
something.
meetings can be focused
If you need
more on
to,
the
yeah.
report.
Good idea.
Okay. Any other thoughts?
If the attendance is anything like when the Board of Selectmen have their public input session, there'll be 5 people in a room.
Well,
If we're lucky.
again, I think all we can do is put it out there and see what the response is. And I know,
I'm coming off as negative,
no, it's,
but
Realistic.
it is what it is.
if you're a pessimist, you'll never be disappointed, right?
That's exactly right.
need to talk to a
There is
reporter.
nothing in the glass.
Get an article in the Lowell Sun or something about what we're doing and
Right.
with a date in it. I mean, if you just post it on the town website.
Well, I
you're not
think,
gonna
right,
get-
I think we need to think about how, multiple avenues there, and right, the Sun, I'm sure, would be happy to put a little blurb in, Tom Cristiano, I'm sure, would be happy
Well,
to.
like you said, make it, you know,
something.
specifically invite the town meeting reps. That might
Right,
encourage.
and make sure they all get an invitation.
Yeah, it might encourage some of them to come.
And tell them to bring other people. Then you have 15 people there.
Okay. All right, so,
Where,
pardon?
where would you like to do it?
Yeah, I think that's the $64,000 question. What do you guys think? I hear what you're saying about an empty room.
Well, I think that the
But-
police station does draw people, for some reason. It's a nice room, it's airy, it's modern, there's enough elbow room, as
Mhm.
opposed to maybe the chairs here if it was filled.
Yep.
It's just a nice room for public hearings, I think.
Okay, I'll reach out, I'll check there and see if the 28th is available there. And then, who do
So-
we talk to if we want to do clicker input?
I think the town clerk.
Okay.
I mean, Ted's gonna be the one that's gonna have to program it.
Right. So we'll need a list of questions ahead of time, right? I mean, it's difficult to program on the fly.
And we could say that it's interactive meeting, it might draw people more if they knew that
Yeah.
they were gonna be doing something
Yeah.
beforehand, yeah.
Okay. Couple of other things on the report. What do you think about a history section? Do we need to go over what's been done before?
I don't think so, just because I think it would create more of a controversy, a negative controversy than not. Just my thought.
About the previous reports, you mean?
I mean, I know it's always good to know history, but if they really would like that information, they can certainly acquire it.
What about a history of classification within Chelmsford?
At a high level, at a very high level.
Well, even beyond that, perhaps. I mean, I think it's on the one hand, we can show the rates over time. We have that data. And I think it's obvious to anyone who looks that there was a point at which Chelmsford used a higher classification rate.
Well, we can show the results, as you were speaking before about the numbers. It
Right,
could
if we
be part
talk
of-
about trends,
Yep.
what do we want to put that data together with any other kind of information? Do we want to look at trends in
It's all
occupied
trend-based.
space or?
The whole thing's trend-based. So if you look back when Chelmsford had classification, the trends are pretty self-explanatory based upon the economic cycles.
What kind of trends? What kind of data are you talking about looking at there?
Why it went up and why it went down. Why it was at 27% and why it,
So you're talking about,
isn't that what you're talking about?
well, I think that's certainly one aspect of it, yeah. I think, but there's probably more than that. And this is where I think we might need to have some arguments about what useful metrics are. And also when we talk about trends, to try somehow to tease out the effects of changes in the classification rate from the overall business cycle at the time, right? And perhaps that's a place where comparisons with other towns are useful. If Billerica was holding its rate constant and Westford was holding its rate constant, we can look at at least try to get a sense of the relative differences, and then you can say, well, if we were going north and they were going south.
I think you're throwing in so many different variables that you're making it so complex.
It is a very complex
I understand
question,
it, I
and
understand
I
it is,
think
but,
that's.
but, especially when you throw in stuff from other communities, I think that just exponentially increases the complexity and would drop people off from having any, pursuing it further. I mean, that's just my opinion.
Which other people? Because I really only care about 5 other people. Because
Well, I think the 5 other people will do their own research into that if that's what they feel is going to be part of their decision-making process.
Okay. I mean, part of what I'm thinking about is, can we give those 5 people, the selectmen, kind of a cheat sheet? What should they be looking at to see? Is now a good time to change the classification rate? Is it time, is it, you know, if it's up, should we lower it? If it's low, should we raise it? How do you evaluate the effects of having a change like that? Obviously, you don't want to drive the train right into the brick wall. Hopefully, if you get onto the wrong track, you get some indication along the way, some kind of intermediate feedback before the wall arrives.
I have a sense the Board of Selectmen are looking for very specific items to direct them clearly. And I don't think we're talking about giving them that. And that concerns me.
So what, expand on that a little bit.
Well, say if we have numbers from Billerica, Westford, Lincoln, all of these different towns have different situations economically, tax-wise from the state, public education-wise. I don't know how we can compare ourselves in Chelmsford to anybody else, to tell you the truth. So if we get that information, which we certainly can, what does it really mean? I would rather see, myself, specific information from maybe the history of Chelmsford. Maybe that would be better.
Okay.
Chelmsford only. Because, do you agree with that, Pat? Or do you think that it should be more general with regard to other cities and towns' information that we gather?
I mean, you know, every selectman, I think, has their own process for how they determine how they're going to vote on tax classification. You know, I try to focus most exclusively on Chelmsford and don't look that much at the other communities, quite frankly. But others do care about, they have put more input into, you know, the business structure, I guess you could say, of other communities, and then compare that to whether they have classification. So, you know, like I said, I'm not that interested in other communities. I am very interested in the town of Chelmsford, but other selectmen, like I said, are different. So,
Yeah.
I think using other communities as, citing what's going on in other communities can be useful in the report, in the sense that it may be used to support or talk against things that we might be pointing out. For example, the split in residential and commercial. I mean, you look at some of the communities that do classification. I'm just looking here at Burlington, where the commercial percent is 38%. Okay, I mean, when we're talking about how, because of the 20/80 split we have here in Chelmsford, that a shift doesn't make that big a difference and has a big impact on business. Whereas I'm sure in Burlington, where the ratios are different, then a shift of X amount has a greater impact on the residents, and not that great percentage-wise an impact on the businesses.
It's distributed a little bit
Because
more
it's
broadly, yeah.
So using other communities as examples of how it works or doesn't work in their communities. Somebody was it Sam, telling me there's one of the communities that said, why are they doing it? Well, they've got a big business in town that they want to shift the, you know, their 10% business is mainly one business, so they're shifting it onto that. And there may be things we can illustrate by these specific examples, but that would be my sense of how you might use other communities. But in general, talking about what the history of other communities is doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me.
Okay.
But then I did talk to one community who had a single tax rate and very few businesses. And then all of a sudden, there's more businesses than I ever saw in it, and that's Bedford.
Mm-hmm.
And the person on the other end of the phone told me that they didn't get those businesses till they had a double tax rate, and they didn't understand why. So
But there may have been other factors going on. Why if suddenly we have a
Certainly.
whole lot of, why do you suddenly have a whole lot of businesses coming in? I can't believe it's solely the tax rate, and the fact
Well-
that you shifted it the other way certainly isn't going be the reason. I mean,
said-
I think finding out some of those reasons might be helpful, but I think only putting them in a report and, in an illustrative way.
Oh, I'm not saying put it in
Yeah.
a report, because I don't have any more
Yeah,
background
no, but
on
I
that.
mean,
Well, I think, again, I think that's the challenge. Can we find a way to rather than it being a single anecdote, are there broader patterns
I don't know.
in
Do you
terms
walk
of
in and
what
just
happens
ask
to
them?
the ratio of residential to CIP when classification is adopted? What happens when it's abandoned? Is it
At the highest level.
Right.
You're using those trends to try to make some general characterizations related to what are the expected or projected
Mhm.
implications,
right? Okay, so
right?
I think we're talking about doing something a little bit different here. If you go to the sheet that Sheila passed out, the questions from the 2004 study committee, number 6 is there a minimum or maximum level at which classification does or does not make sense?
Can I-
That's kind of just a survey of what's out there.
But didn't we hear last time that the way they figured the 2004 tax classification wasn't complete, or,
Well, I think they're
so why
their
do we want to do that?
description- Well, their description of the assessment process did not mark well to reality. But some of these other questions were just surveys of the existing or
That's why I say I
available
think
data.
it may be easier for
That's
us to
w-
answer these questions.
Right.
And then figure out how to organize.
That's the thing. We can take a very Q&A kind of approach, or we can take a more scenario-driven approach. And maybe the best way to do that is just to start, as you say, answering some of these questions,
start
building
answering,
some
yeah.
scenarios. If people want to go home and play with the data a little bit, and then come back and just show the committee what you've got, and we can talk about, is this the sort of thing that makes sense or not? I like the scenario approach, but there is a certain kind of cleanliness to the more Q&A approach. Things are very simple that way. So maybe there's a history section.
one paragraph.
Perhaps a single paragraph is enough, right? But something that indicates we've done a literature survey.
I mean, I'm looking at this thing, and I'm seeing the first 3 questions, and I'm putting that into one paragraph.
Oh, good.
Yes, and I think we can maybe that's a good. We should have some kind of overview. What is tax classification, and how is it implemented? I think that's probably more than one paragraph. I think Frank has already given us about a page, which is a pretty reasonable summary. I think maybe a couple of pages. Yeah, I think we ought to have a section of the just kind of the nuts and bolts. How does it work? The mechanics of classification. Should we have a standalone section on public input?
I think it depends on what kind of public input you
Yeah,
get,
Okay, that can be a
if
maybe.
any.
Yeah.
I think maybe some of this is still going to come to us as we
Yes, I
as we
agree.
put this together, and maybe we can't outline this whole thing at this point in time.
I would, I draw a distinction between classification and exemptions,
Oh, yeah.
right? So if we have one section on how classification works, we should probably have another section on how exemptions work. That's something that we've been asked to do, and again, I think that's a pretty kind of hardcore thing that we can put together without, there shouldn't be very much dispute about it. It's just a question of how do you present the information cogently. So if we have a description of how classification works, a description of how the exemptions work, then maybe the next logical thing is scenarios. What happens if you adopt a split rate? What happens if you adopt a split rate plus a small business exemption? What happens, right? I
Piece by piece.
Right. I think that's I think that's the best way to approach this, is just try to break it down into bite-sized chunks.
I think when we talk about tax classification, not everybody understands what that means.
Agreed.
It's a long word. So I'm just wondering if we're looking at different sections, if we could split that out into tax rates, residential, business, and then go to tax exemptions, and then go to small business tax exemptions, so that it,
Yes.
does that make sense? It makes it simpler
It does,
possibly?
and perhaps a different standalone section would be on the assessment process itself.
Mhm.
That's where I think maybe there should be some historical review. I think it's important to kind of document the Board of Selectmen subcommittee's findings and remind people that fair market value is not the same as sale price.
That could be a separate section.
Well, I think if we do.
That's one sentence.
If we,
That's one
well,
sentence.
that's one sentence, but I think we may need to back that up a little bit with the description of how assessments are
That-
done
that may be.
and how they're monitored. Because I would hate to walk away and still have that as an open question.
So these are the large points. These
I
are-
think these are the top level headings. And then the last one might be recommendations. And perhaps we should just have a meeting at the end. People can bring all their recommendations and we can vote on them. I'm not sure if there's a better way to do that.
Interactive.
Well, let's just keep the interaction to the committee.
Yeah.
That'll be hard enough.
Isn't breaking down these scenarios very, very complicated?
I would think so.
Because,
Let's see how complicated it is.
because you've got property worth $100,000 and you got property worth
Right,
residential
right,
$1 million,
right.
and you really can't deal with average on that.
But Frank when Frank presents to the board, he's using assumptions and averages, I believe. So if we
Yeah,
just-
but
Yeah.
and he does
Yeah.
different values of homes.
He presented
Right.
some
Yeah.
things
So we
that were.
maybe we adopt the
We
same.
we can look at what he's done. I know he's done the residential exemption. I don't recall if I've seen a small commercial exemption scenario from him. Just, but yeah, let's see how much it takes, because I agree. I don't necessarily want this to be a 100-page report.
You don't want it to be overly complicated.
Right.
No, but
Right. But some of that might get buried in an appendix as well.
Better choice of words. Thank you.
Making lots of assumptions.
One more general topic heading would be interviews with other towns. Unless you want to try to take what we learn from them and put it back into some of the other existing headings. But I'm thinking in particular the towns, obviously Lincoln is one that's of interest. But towns that have adopted and then abandoned classification,
But didn't we do that?
we did.
Then let's interview us, and why do we do it?
Let's. I think, I actually
Go any further because-
think that's a good idea. I think we need to come up with a list of questions to ask some of these other towns, but while we're asking, Russell and Longmeadow and all the rest, we still have some institutional knowledge of classification being implemented and being de-implemented in Chelmsford, and I think it would behoove us to talk to the people who were there for that. I think that's a good idea.
Still here. They're still here.
ready them around anyway.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, yes. They are here.
Well, it sounds like you've been in
I
contact with a
have
couple.
been in contact with them
Well-
before being on this committee.
I think you just earned yourself a subcommittee appointment.
I don't think it's very good for me to do.
Let's talk about that a little bit. Are there questions that we'd like to ask other towns? There are.
Are we going to go to these towns and talk to these people? What are we going to do?
I think we should try to do that.
So,
I mean, the best.
As individuals,
some
we
of
should
these-
go, right?
I think so. I mean,
Okay, I'm willing to
phone
do that.
calls will work. In-person interviews are fine too. I don't know who you'll be able to find. I mean, some of these communities adopted a split rate back in 2002 or 2005 and then abandoned it in 2011. I don't know if there's anybody around who remembers that, but I think we can at least start with the town managers or the mayors.
Well, the assessor's office, I would think would be a good start.
Perhaps. I think my expectation is that at least in a number of cases, the changes were politically driven rather than financially driven. And if that's the case, I think we want to talk to people on the political side to get a sense of what they were hearing, what they were thinking, and what kind of things they were looking at when they made these decisions. And again, I think these are all good questions for the Chelmsford folks as well.
But that could get really foggy, because if it's political, you don't know who you're speaking to,
I
actually.
mean, a Google search brings up a lot of newspaper articles, gives you a pretty good sense
Really?
as to
Yeah.
Okay?
Oh,
what the arena of discussion was about. May not need to speak to anybody unless we decide on one or two key communities.
All right, so should we start then just reviewing the history in Chelmsford? Is that where people want to begin?
That one, I think you could use real people on.
Yeah. Should we ask people to come in and talk to us?
there's no harm in that.
Okay.
Look at me.
I'm fine.
Okay. Well, let's see if we can do that then. I don't have a list of folks who are on the Board of Selectmen during those years.
They're in here somewhere, I think.
Town clerk has that information.
Yeah.
I saw it somewhere.
Town report's going back.
Yeah, that's right. Town reports
That's
go
true.
back forever,
Town
yeah.
reports you
We'll
are.
have
Okay.
all that information.
It said on that committee. Where I saw it, I don't know.
How broad should this be? Should this be the 5 people who were on the board the year it was implemented and the 5 people who were on the board the year it went back to 1.0?
I think we
Or
should,
should it be everybody in that
I
interim?
think you find whoever you can get.
Yeah, I don't think you need
Okay.
to have 15 people
No.
here.
No,
There
no,
could be
right.
that many
You
people
won't
that
get
were
that many.
involved in it.
All right, well, do you guys have any particular recollections of this? Were there key players that,
I don't remember. It's
from the
it's a
Board of
while ago.
Selectmen at the time?
yeah.
Board of
I'm
Selectmen.
willing to bet Dennis Reddy was one of them on the
Right.
board at the
You're
time,
probably
so.
right, yeah. And I think the person that Helen's talking about is Mr.
What year?
DeFreitas, right?
What year?
We're talking
But he
the-
was the one for 94, I
who- who
think.
we-
He was also on the 94
Was-
subcommittee.
Yes.
This tax classification of Chelmsford, according to this thing Frank gave us, started in 1987 and went until 1998.
Okay.
So it was mainly the 90s, starting in 87. And I know it had to do with the sewer project, to shift some of it to the business side because of the implications of the requirement to sewer the Chelmsford Center. And that's where the sewer project started. And it was connected with that was the reason they did my vague memory of why they did classification then. And as the sewer project became less I can't remember why they phased it out, to be quite honest. But that would have been, and the decision to phase it out must have started, because the last 3 years were a phase out, so we went from,
Right, it was phased in and then
Or-
phased out.
and it was, so I want to say the decision to phase it out had to have happened about the mid-1990s, around 1995.
Be good to know if that was the plan,
Pardon?
phasing in and phasing out over a 10-year
Yeah.
period. It'd be good to know if that was
Yeah.
the plan. Or if they just, if it is, you know, we're winging it.
Well, okay, so rather than try to come up with a list of specific questions, we'll review, I guess everybody can review whatever they can find online,
Okay.
and I'll get a roster from the town clerk and see if people are willing to come and talk to us about what they were thinking at the time. Okay. That is pretty much what I've got for the structure. Anybody else thoughts on what the report should look like? Anything we've overlooked? Okay. All right, the only other thing really under new business is would be the presentations. Evan sent out a PowerPoint presentation a little while ago, last week, I think, and Sheila also sent out a link to some discussion online. And as part of that discussion, I believe you presented some of that report, right?
At the June 1st event
Yeah.
you sent out?
The Middlesex
Yeah, I was
3.
there. I
Yeah.
presented some of that. Yeah.
So, I don't know if everybody's had a chance to see it, and kind
it
of
was
read through the
interesting.
PowerPoint or not, but I thought I'd ask Sheila to kind of start the discussion on the takeaways from that presentation.
I spoke with Don Van Dyne after speaking with Evan, and he indicated that I had some questions basically about the logo, the Crossroads logo, the new marketing for the Crossroads. And he sent me this video as an answer, and, you know, I looked at the video, it was absolutely phenomenal. These are the types of things I wanted to see in the town. These are the types of things that I think should be seen. It was a lot of energy. There's been a lot of, you know, movement forward from the business community and the Economic Development Committee. They've done an amazing job, if you ask me. And I just think that when we're talking about tax classification, that the residents cannot miss viewing something like this, because it is so important, I believe, to the future of the town and to the future of their town and their taxes, because businesses create, you know, more money for the town. And I just think that it was absolutely amazing, and I know that, you know, what Evan is going to say probably takes into consideration everything that was spoken about at the meeting. The 129 corridor is going to be phenomenal. I mean, there's going to be subways, there's a restaurant that's going to take place, that's going to happen there. There's just a lot of things that are very exciting that have been started in the past 10 years. And you went to a meeting, right, Dan?
Yes.
That you really enjoyed?
Yes.
So do you think?
You shut me up.
Yeah. Oh. But it's very exciting information, and I think that part of the information was put online, but I just think that a lot of people in town should view these economic development presentations or go to their meetings to try to understand the tax classification and, you know, what all these discussions mean for the residents in the community looking forward into the future. Because I think, you know, we look at our homes and we look at our personal lives, but we need to see what else is there. We need to see the big picture and what could happen in the future to help the community and our homes and our residences and our children's education. So, you know, that's basically all I have to say is that I think the link should be out there more. People should look at it and, you know, consider all the information. Don't shut down your mind to a couple of ideas. Look at the whole big picture and, you know, look at business from different angles, look at residential improvements in the future from different angles. And I think it's presentations like this that that really are very positive for a lot of people to review.
I have a bunch of questions that I watched the presentation and looked at the stuff Evan has done and came up with a number of things. First of all, going back, and maybe you won't know this, Evan, I'm looking again at this thing that Frank prepared, the history in Chelmsford, the long term and the rate. Why, I mean, for the last, goodness, 20, 30 years maybe, we've had pretty close to this 80-20 split. Do you have any idea what it was in the late 80s when we were up to like 27, 28%? And maybe Sam knows either. Does that
I
have
had
to
my
do-
theories, and I actually asked Sam, and as I kind of said vaguely earlier, it's pretty obvious once you understand what was going on at that time in Chelmsford. It was the build-out of 129
Okay,
during a 5 to 10 year period. 6 million square feet was built.
okay.
And it was assessed that as new growth and new construction.
Basically,
Okay.
new growth, right.
Okay, it's so,
So that's a blip in the history of
Okay.
Chelmsford.
Why would it be a blip? Why didn't it,
Well, because
why wasn't it a step up and then kind of a new plateau?
It was for a period of probably 5 years, 10
Yeah.
years at max. And then the presentation that I submitted explains where 129 was 25, 30 years later.
Well, let's talk about that a little bit. Do you want to?
Yeah.
Oh,
okay, maybe I can hold, because some of it was leading me to, can we reasonably expect this ratio to change with the buildup of 129? I mean, that's new growth, but what does new growth do to us? It helps increase the tax.
Great question, and I think the
Yeah.
second or the last slide of this presentation puts that into context.
Let me go through where I am, and then, because the new growth just increases the tax levy, but it adds these enhanced commercial products to the tax base. But I was watching your presentation about the 129 corridor and the multifamily or whatever, where you showed, I mean, apartment buildings are residential, correct? Where's my assessor? So it looked like for every improvement commercially, you were showing me an apartment building of some significance going up. So I'm just beginning to wonder, are we doing, I mean, yes, we're doing wonderful things enhancing the business down there, but also enhancing some residential things. And is anything going to majorly change this 20-80 split in doing these kinds of things?
Not in a 5 or 10 year period.
Yeah, that's what I'm looking at. And so maybe you
I
have,
think the last slide
Okay.
on this presentation says you need $83 million of new tax growth to move the needle 2 percentage points.
And
So-
and just for comparison or scale, what are we talking about at 129
So
that's
that- I mean-
in the pipeline?
So, I mean, that, there's probably a $7 or $10 million commercial proposal. And that's the only one that's known, that's
Mhm.
in the pipeline in front of the planning board. I mean, that $83 million is not unreasonable, but it's not gonna happen
Yeah.
instantaneously. The rezoning takes time to be implemented. It takes cycles. So it's just gaining traction as we speak.
and
And
what's
that
it,
June 1st event was,
Yeah.
a good example of gaining traction. Gaining traction doesn't necessarily mean that
Yeah.
existing property owners or new investors are lining up to spend their money. The first development is critical, even though it's small, $7 or $10 million. That's a critical proof statement. And maybe additional property owners and investors will take notice. But, I mean, as Pat said, it's very complicated. I mean, obviously, if the town had a choice between commercial or residential, the town would obviously pick commercial development.
Depending where it is.
Well, the multifamilies in 129. On the other hand, if you were told, well, what kind of commercial development, the town may say thanks, but no thanks. So this presentation, I think, provides a lot of insight as to kind of what is going on down there. And now that it's rezoned, you know, what the potential future may be. But the existing conditions are pretty well ingrained. It's going to take a lot more than rezoning for that, that transition to occur. It may take more than 1 or 2 real estate cycles.
But the rezoning has resulted in increase in the residential component with these apartments.
The residential component, the market determined that residential was the highest and best use prior to the rezoning. The rezoning acknowledged that that was a good idea for certain aspects of economic development, and that it was a critical component based upon the feedback that the Economic Development Commission received in speaking with property owners, commercial brokers, and developers.
Outside of 129, is Chelmsford pretty well built out in terms of other potential commercial development?
Commercially, it's pretty much built out. I mean, I've been here 10 years, and pretty much all the new development has been multifamily. Multifamily along Route 110, multifamily 129. Again, that was market-driven and partially because, you know, we're a good community, we're full infrastructure, and we weren't at 10% yet. But that, when you speak to folks on the Economic Development Commission, they will explain to you that the multifamily, while it's not direct commercial development, it's needed to provide a new socioeconomic segment that does not exist here. And in order to attract new business, they're looking for certain data points.
Yeah.
You need a population growth, which Chelmsford hasn't had in 25 years. It's been stagnant. In fact, we
Yeah.
lost population in the last census. So you need population growth, and you also need, or the desire is to have lower age rather than older age. So this is nothing new. I mean, Chelmsford has kind of lived a full cycle.
I mean, it was very clear from your presentation that's what was happening, and some of the reasons.
So the multifamily, I think, is a natural evolution of Chelmsford transitioning its socioeconomics.
But I guess I bring this up because you talk about what goes into the report, but I think in a way, talking about this, I mean, Evan talks about it in his presentations in one way, but talking about it in terms of what it means for the town, the fact that except for the 129 corridor, we're unlikely to get further commercial development.
Unless the town creates new zoning opportunities for
Okay.
commercial development, which historically the town has viewed that as zoning creep.
Or redevelopment, right?
Redevelopment,
Is
yeah.
there any significant opportunity for that?
Townwide, there is. A good example is Skip's redevelopment.
Mm-hmm.
That was assessed at, I wish Frank were here, but it was an excessive increase from existing assessed value to the new assessed value. That's a good example of the potential redevelopment that could take place in pretty much every commercial property in town. They're dated, they have high depreciation rates, lack of investment.
Is there $83 million in redevelopment?
Not all at once. Not all at once. I mean, that's kind of the challenge that Chelmsford has, is that it's commercial. It's a built-out, mature suburban community, and the choices that Chelmsford made when it was laying out zoning districts, they prioritized protecting residential zoning districts and not succumbing to the easy inclination of zoning miles and miles and miles of Route 110. If you go to Billerica or Tewksbury, all of 110 from Lowell to downtown Chelmsford would have been commercial. So Chelmsford knew enough to not sacrifice all of its, nice residential neighborhoods.
Mm-hmm.
Whether they knew how that would play out 30 years later, it remains to be seen. But I think the town did a good job in planning for where it wanted development and what kind of development. We're now left with, it's built out. It's It's an aging stock
But I
of
think that does
commercial
have,
property.
that does have implications for, you know, at various times, various people have made the suggestion, well, we just need to wait for the turn. And once we get back to that 27, 28% commercial, well, everybody's residential rates will go down accordingly. But yeah, if that's not a realistic outlook, then I think we should find a way to put something like
I
that into
think
the
that's
report and say
important.
that that's,
Right,
that
that needs
shouldn't
to
be
be
part
within
of your
context.
thinking
Right.
anymore.
I mean, we keep talking about, we need to increase the commercial,
Right.
whatever, and it just, the more I looked at it, the more I said, I just don't think it's gonna
think-
happen to any great extent.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of the, outside of 129, most of the commercial industrial property is locally owned. And some of it is locally occupied. And if you look at that demographic, those are many of the people who built Chelmsford into what it is today, and they're aging out.
Yeah.
So what will be interesting to see is what happens over the next 10, 15, 20 years of all of that commercial space that's in the Vano Square, Chelmsford Center, that's locally owned. I think part of the challenge is that there isn't a lot of commercial property that is for sale in Chelmsford. People who own it, they hold it long-term, it's family-owned, and it's very likely family-occupied. So that's kind of the uniqueness of Chelmsford. I'm not sure Billerica or Tewksbury or other communities have the same kind of property ownership that we have, where it's held for a very, very long time. And if you're mortgage-free, you may not have as much of incentive to invest. You may have good long-term relationships with your tenants, which speaks to, the strengths of Chelmsford's small business community. And then you have kind of 129, which is entirely different, struggles with some of the same themes, but it's not due to lack of good local ownership.
That helps, thank you. I just observed, you commented about population has remained pretty steady, which it has, but isn't it true also that the number of dwelling places has increased a great deal, so that we're all living, the occupants, there's smaller number of occupants per
Yeah, that's a
per dwelling
national, it's a
unit.
national trend.
Yes.
The household number
So
of
we
people
built,
living in a house
we built
is.
a lot of new residential properties over the past, say, 20, certainly since it's 30-some years that I've lived here now, but in that time, I know when we moved here, it was 30-something thousand population, and it hasn't changed a whole
It's
lot.
now
but
at about 34.
Yeah, but I do know that the number of dwelling units has increased. I just looking at this sheet that you hang up, and let me just ask another one. The mix of commercial properties, and you talk about family-owned businesses in town. How much is what one would call big business in town, and how much is smaller businesses, mom and pops?
I can only do it by square footage, so there's about 8 million square feet in town, commercial, industrial.
Total.
6 million of that is down in 129.
Okay.
I think Frank, in one of Frank's reports, I think he may have had upwards of 9 million square feet, but I may have been looking at a different, the wrong column.
Okay, and
How would you define big and small?
I don't know how I define big business,
Okay. Well, I think one of the things that the report can look at is how many places would be eligible for a small business
and
or a
Frank-
small commercial exemption.
Frank
That's
had
one way of measuring it. But somebody, I think, has made the point that there's a tweener population as well, right? It's not just your either Walmart or
right.
a guy in his shed. It's the $2 million places that might be hit hard.
Even Drum Hill, amazingly, has probably a third of it is locally owned, Chelmsford residents. And it's family-run, it's a family-run real estate business.
On the sheet where Frank talked about small
Right.
commercial exemption, he says in FY18 there were 454 commercial properties. 368 were assessed for less than $1 million. So if we use that, $1 million, or based on an assessment in terms of the size of the you know, the property owned, that's only 86 properties that are assessed at more than $1 million, commercial properties assessed at more than $1 million.
Right, and presumably
So it's-
thereby impacted with a split rate if we can balance a small business exemption to keep people off the hook. And again, I think that's one of the scenarios we need to look at. I don't know if that's possible or not.
Yeah, but again, it's a small number of commercial enterprises that
Right.
constitute that bigger business kind
Yeah.
of thing, and the smaller commercials. Now, he said there were, of that 368 valued at less than $1 million, he knew of 114 that would qualify for
Right.
small, but he feels that there were, he said a couple times,
Probably more,
a whole lot more than that. So, anyway,
I think
numbers
that
to keep in
I
mind.
think that's a really interesting question, and I think we need to think about what kind of light that sheds on some of the questions, some of the scenarios.
Yeah, I mean, you know, who are you, if you're shifting it, who are you shifting it to?
Right,
And where
right.
is it
Who's got to
going?
pick up the slack?
And then if, based on those questions that were on the ballot that said, would you support a small business? And everybody said yes to both questions. We want a split tax rate and small business exemption. Well, when a whole lot of your businesses are going to qualify for that small business exemption, it doesn't leave a whole lot to shift things to.
I had thought Frank said that he thought that of the 140 or 120 that were assessed at under $1 million, thought he said that once you got into the employees, that number would drastically
Yeah,
be reduced. Right, it doesn't have to be 1 million
Or
plus
maybe
no
that
more
was
than
of
10
the
employees or
300.
something.
he said there are, what he's written in here said 368 were assessed for less than $1 million.
Okay, so then maybe that 120 number is what.
Yeah, is
his-
what only has 10
Okay,
employees,
A hundred-
qualifies with only 10 employees or less.
114, according to some lists,
Right.
would have qualified, but
The state sends out an
Right.
annual list, but
he feels
his point
there
was-
that if that were to be implemented, he'd hear about a whole lot more of them that would
Right.
qualify. So we're talking, who knows, of that 368, maybe half of them would qualify. Just,
yeah, that seems like
Hypothetically.
not an unreasonable increase, honestly.
Can I ask a question? And I'm not sure this even fits into this, but I listened to you talk, and the apartment building is going to house families? Or-
Unlikely,
Unlikely.
yeah.
Okay. Because then my question would be, well, wait a minute, are we going to now worry about schools? And if so, then we need to put that in the equation.
Mhm.
That's all I was thinking.
Yeah, most of the 40Bs in Chelmsford generate school-aged children at a much lower rate than
A
studies.
surprisingly low rate, yeah.
yeah, it is.
But that apartment building wouldn't be 40B, would it? No,
Most of them are.
the one that they're talking about building on the 129 corridor. Oh, okay.
I remember when, I don't know if I was on, I think I was on the school committee at about the time they were talking about Kensington, and
Mhm.
everybody was worried about how many kids that was going to impact, and it was almost nothing.
Right.
So
Yeah,
it
Steadily increased over the years.
did, yeah, but
Probably 30, 35, I think, at this point.
And I think that's the high one, right?
Yes.
Everybody, yeah, their ratio is 0.9 or something per unit, but I think in Chelmsford, the average is something like 0.28 or 0.3 per
I don't know.
unit. It's a low number.
it's very low.
And that's true, that's been true across the state. So one of the things that struck me watching the presentation and reading through the summary of the work that had been done earlier, nowhere in any of it did I see a reference to the tax rate or the classification rate.
Yeah, I thought
This
of that
is
too.
a ton of work that's been done by, people looking hard at how do you grow the economy here in Chelmsford. And it strikes me that they are not at all concerned about the tax classification rate. It's not used, it's not one of the selling points to draw businesses in. there's no concern that it might be implemented and drive businesses away. It just seems to be a very small factor in kind of the world that the economic development folks are living in.
I'm not prepared to speak to that. I mean, tonight, I think if EDC does attend one of your meetings, I think they may. I think Lisa Maroney, the business development director, is more willing to engage in that conversation. Editorially, I can say that there's never been a need to market that as one of the reasons, because it's an advantage having a single tax rate, and word hasn't really. No one's actively putting it on the table that it's under consideration, and that would be premature to do that.
Oh, yeah.
And 129 is, it's as you'll see from the presentation, it's a strange animal. Some businesses may value that more than others, and some investors may value it more than others. At a certain point, it's just part of their mathematical formula.
Mm-hmm.
They have a number and they have a methodology and a business model.
Right. Well, I mean, there's certainly discussion of TIFs and access and a number of other factors. And as the town manager pointed out the other day, if a business really wanted to break, a TIF is a
big
the way
business.
they go
I mean,
after.
I did watch the video. I mean, while any business or entity can ask for a TIF, and I think Chelmsford has, Chelmsford's town meeting record is approving 8 out of 8 requests. None of them, other than the Kronos one, and even that one wasn't substantial in scope and scale compared to TIFs you read about. But I think it's pretty safe to say that if there were a transformative development or a big company that was looking to fill lots of square footage and make a significant capital investment and personal property investment, while it's part of the game and it's expected that TIF conversations take place, it's an important economic development tool.
Mm-hmm. Is there any kind of guidelines within the town that, if somebody comes in with a $2 million proposal, they're not going to get listened to, or do folks like that just not even bother to ask because there's so much work involved?
There's no written policy or framework. I think part of that is because there hasn't really been a need.
Right.
The requests haven't been huge tax implications. But we probably, more than 50% of the initial conversations, once it's explained to them, that if you're not over a certain value, it's just not worth the time and energy.
Right.
And again, what speaks to 129 is that the trends have been small investments. Even a retenanting doesn't generate a large capital expenditure. And that's the kind of
Right.
business development we've been seeing.
Okay. Other questions or comments?
So far as the build-out of companies coming up Route 3, do you take that into consideration? Are they getting closer to Chelmsford so far as companies right on Route 3? Is Burlington taken, Billerica taken, and then they'll possibly come to Chelmsford?
That's part of it. Companies that want to be located in Burlington, if they can afford it, though they will locate in Burlington. Many companies will look on 128 and realize they can't afford it, and then they march their way up Route 3. On the other hand, Chelmsford pulls a lot of its labor pool from southern New Hampshire, and if you're a company that's interested in pulling your labor force from southern New Hampshire, you're less likely to locate on 128, even though it's 10 miles, as you know, going from Chelmsford down to Burlington adds a lot to the commuting time. So, one of the strengths of 129 has always been that it's very diversified, types of businesses, industries, size, ownership. We have world headquarters, regional headquarters, local. We have warehouse distribution, R&D, high tech. It's very diversified, which I think has been a saving grace for 129, unlike other industrial parks that have a very strong cluster of many, many companies, and if one goes, the whole park kind of falls down.
Okay, thank you.
So a lot of these questions are the questions that the EDC spent time
Right.
researching. We still struggle with some of those questions. So, one is, what is the future of 129 within the regional marketplace? We know what it was 30 years ago, the microchip and so forth. What you heard as part of that June 1st event was that the town has a grant from Mass Development to do, it's a $90,000 grant in which experts are going to be brought into the town, work closely with the Economic Development Commission to come up with some real market-driven analysis, find out what our competitive sweet spot should be or is within the regional marketplace, and give us a better understanding as to what types of businesses truly want to be located here. We've all heard, why is biotech not in Chelmsford? Should we go after biotech? This study will give us the information, so we'll be able to target the right kind of industries and sectors, which doesn't necessarily result in transformative economic development. What it will do is fill those buildings up. But the piece that's transformative is in order to get high-quality businesses that want to make a long-term commitment, you have to have the baseline level of amenities, which is what the rezoning's all about.
Do you have kind of a blue sky projection? If all the trees grow all the way to the sky, what's the upside there? I mean, are we talking 80 million? Are we talking 150 million?
I think you could have that. I think that is a reasonable number. I mean, if you look at just filling the existing vacancy with good, high-quality businesses that have high personal property, which if you look at our personal property compared to others, we have a pretty high personal property compared to the total square footage we have. Personal property provides a lot of revenue. So part of the challenge is attracting high-quality businesses. You can't do that without high-quality amenities.
Right, and it won't happen overnight.
It won't
But
happen, right.
again, I think maybe we can put some bounds on expectations.
Yeah, I mean,
If everything goes well, we're still not going to go to a 30-70 split. Best case scenario is something like, 25-75 maybe?
Even that may be,
Right.
all the trees.
Right, yeah, all the way.
Right.
And again, I think that can be a useful tool
Definitely. 'Cause
in
it
kind of
puts it in perspective. I can tell you
framing the debate.
3 years ago, when I was doing the rezoning, I mean, I was somewhat naive. I thought that there was some sort of scenario where the town could get back up to 27.
Right.
And as you learn, you begin to realize that may have just been a blip in the build-out history of
Right.
Chelmsford. And now you're left with trying to maximize the existing 6 million square feet down there, and that's what the rezoning is about. Which I think, if successful, we could have high-quality businesses, mixed-use type developments are valued and assessed at a higher value. Housing plays a component in that. The live-work-play environment is just has a higher value. And that's incrementally what the rezoning is trying to do. Not convert it to a Burlington or a Drum Hill.
Right.
Keep it as an employment center, attracting high-value businesses, lots of personal property, good wages, so the people live in town, can work in town, spend their money in town, restaurants, hotel tax. things
Right,
like that.
and all of that is a more central focus than what we're doing to the relative distribution of property tax rates.
Right.
But it does have some implications, and I think
What we're talking about is future potential. And then, you know, from my perspective, you happen to have this conversation, and how are they related, are they related?
Right.
Just, you know, some of these questions, is it the
Yeah.
right time, and.
Right, is it, well, I think, yeah, that, I think it very definitely goes to, is it a right time? Is there something about to change or changing now? And
And I think that's what we're kind of talking about, what is realistic expectation for
exactly.
129?
I have another question relative to the 120, the overlay zone and whatever. Do we allow buildings where you might have a commercial enterprise at the lowest level and apartments
So
above?
mixed use, yep.
And that's mixed use. How is that assessed? Is it part residential, part commercial? or is it-
I don't know what the methodology is on that. What I can tell you is that probably 5 or 6 years ago, I worked with Frank on assessed values per acre in different parts of town. And surprisingly, Center Village, 'cause per acre is the highest assessed value because it's mixed use. It's dense development, walkable, and in mixed use.
I'm just struck, and I guess maybe this is more connected with big cities or whatever, but at mixed-use development, certainly my daughter lives, and another one used to live in suburban Washington DC. And I mean, just when everything goes up, it's very mixed use in terms of these big complexes developed that consist of businesses with apartments above, townhomes and
Yeah, so
whatever.
the zoning allows all that, what you're seeing on 129, and it's just, again, just Chelmsford is a suburban environment.
It-
You're not necessarily going to see urban development where there's residential and commercial mixed in one building. It may get to that point, but that would be, you know, years
I
down the
think we're
road.
away from that.
Yeah.
I just wondered how that was assessed. Okay.
Yeah, I don't know.
Sam? He might actually know something about how it's assessed.
You have an assessor here, I can answer that question. Yeah. Sam Chase, Board of Assessors. As you know, the the determination of assessment is based on usage,
Yeah.
not construction or who lives there or anything else. It's usage. So the answer to your question is pretty simple. So it is the predominant usage. That is so for example, if you had 70% commercial, 30% residential, it would be classified as commercial use, and that's how it would be assessed.
But if you had one floor of commercial and 4 floors of residential,
It's whatever the determination of predominant usage is, that's how it's assessed. Because one property can only be classified in one use.
okay,
So you have to make that determination.
oh, okay. Evan made reference when we were asking about how taxes affect these companies coming in, that perhaps we want to talk to Lisa Maroney.
Yeah, I think, yep.
Bring
Yeah.
her in,
Sure.
how about?
Yeah, and I think she might
Scheduled for the
she
next
might
meeting?
be the most appropriate
Mm-hmm.
because she's probably got the bird's eye view
And
rather than
she's, I mean, until she came here, she worked in the, what was it?
Leominster.
Leominster
Leominster.
area, so that could be, she might have a broader perspective on all these things as to what's happening in other communities. And
Yeah, and I'd be more willing to engage in that conversation, with Lisa here.
Okay,
I think her experience is different than my experience, but it's all relevant at this point.
I think she could help us understand the answer to
Absolutely.
this
Yeah,
question.
absolutely.
Do
Yeah.
tax rates, how do business look at tax rates when they're coming into a community?
right. And how does it play into
Right.
a bigger overall strategy
Right.
that the town's trying to put
Right,
forward?
Yeah,
Which
absolutely.
is what we're here about.
Right.
Okay.
Okay. Other questions, comments? Okay. For old business, just a quick review of the fact that we are going to change starting next week to Tuesdays instead of Mondays. I had a note here to try to get a time for public input. We've already done that. Sam, do you remember when Westford is going to make their determination? Because we need to put them on the schedule as well, but we're waiting for them to come to a conclusion? It seemed to me we thought they'd be available end of August.
That's the information I have, and I have been in contact with those people. If you want, I can reach out and ask when they'll be done and get that information back to you.
Yeah, let me see if I can find, that information may already be available.
It could
if
be,
they've
yes.
scheduled their meeting, and then we can just
I
talk
think
to
that
them.
they're fairly close
They're
to
close,
wrapping
right?
up. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I don't want to lose track of that, because I think it will be helpful to have them in too. Okay. Any other questions on the schedule? Okay. Public input. Is there anyone who would like to address the committee at this time? Seeing none. Oh, I'm sorry. Please, Glenn. You're slow rolling me here.
You're moving along so quickly tonight. Glenn Diggs, 220 Wellman Ave, a member of the Board of Selectmen. I watched your last meeting. Unfortunately, I wasn't in the area. And I just want to caution you on something that came up during the meeting. There was a mention, it was a very informative meeting. Frank did a great job in explaining everything. And he went through the 9 kind of special exemptions available. And one of the things that I felt was kind of missing in the discussion, and it really needs to be done at another time, but when you get to that point, I wish you would watch it. That is, all of those categories have entrance times, values, in terms of who qualifies. And it's kind of like, if you know anything about astronomy, they talk about another Earth, and it has to be in the Goldilocks area around another sun. In other words, an area where the water can be liquid. And all of these special exemptions have their Goldilocks part of it. For example, one of them has that there's a circuit breaker, and you have to have a certain income. For a husband and wife who are married, I think it's around $80,000. And the way that works is that you take all your income. Now, it's all your income. Social Security, which is not taxed in Massachusetts, public pensions, which are not taxed as a state. But you take all of that. For this purpose, you take all that income and you multiply it times 10%. So let's say that your total income was almost at the max, let's say $80,000, so 10% of that would be $8,000. If your taxes, and they allow you to take your taxes and add your sewer and water costs to that, if that number is greater than that 10%, then you can get that benefit up to that differential. But you have to be the Goldilocks that fits in there. If you make too much money, you don't qualify. If your taxes aren't high enough, you don't qualify. So all of these exemptions have certain Goldilocks. And the question is, how many people fit into that Goldilocks area? And I think many of them, there's really no way to tell, because you don't know exactly everyone's income. And they certainly have a bearing on the overall choice that comes at the end. So if you can see that, or try to rationalize that Goldilocks here, how many people fall into it? If there's a veterans exemption, how many veterans fit that criteria? And I think that will make a difference when you come to the end in terms of fleshing out all the scenarios. That's all. Thank you.
Okay. Action items, I just have a few from tonight. I'm going to look into whether or not the police station is available for August 28th. And also reach out to Ted, you think, about the clickers, or?
Yeah, Ted and town clerk, yeah.
Right. I will also look for a roster of ex-selectmen. But anybody has any special contacts or anything to contribute there, I'd be happy to hear about it. And extend invitations to them to come talk to us. Do we want to try to get them all on one night, or should we just tell them when they can, that we'd be happy to hear them when they can be here. I know it is summertime. And then third, I will reach out to Lisa to have her come in and talk to us a little bit about economic development strategy. I think that's it. Okay.
And should we look at the Google information? What is?
Oh, yeah, just for everybody to try to find what you can online, I guess, about the classification changes. I think a lot of that stuff is probably pre-internet age.
Oh.
So I don't know how, I mean, there are town reports, but I don't know if they'll
from
really
Chelmsford.
say much more than it was adopted or not adopted.
There's usually a commentary. I'll pull
Yeah,
some from it.
you never know. Okay, press questions, looks like none. So then the time being 8:50,
We will
I would
move to
entertain a motion.
adjourn.
Second? All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Okay, unanimous.